In the quiet town of Pine Valley, where everyone knew their neighbors and most people left their doors unlocked at night, something wasn't quite right at the local police department. Officer Reynolds had been with the force for 8 years, and over the past few months, people started noticing changes in his behavior that worried them. It started with small things. A young black business owner noticed he'd been pulled over 3 times in 2 weeks for routine checks. A Hispanic mother was questioned aggressively about her license and registration while taking her kids to school, even though all her papers were in order. An Indian college student was made to wait by his car for over an hour while Officer Reynolds verified his documents. At first, these incidents seemed random, but patterns started emerging. Local community members began sharing their experiences at church gatherings, in coffee shops, and at neighborhood meetings. Mrs. Washington, who ran the local bakery for 30 years, heard similar stories from her customers. "It's like we're being targeted," one regular customer told her while picking up his weekly bread order. "But who's going to believe us?" The atmosphere in Pine Valley grew tense. People who'd lived there all their lives suddenly felt unwelcome in their own hometown. Some started taking different routes to work, while others made sure to drive only during daylight hours. Parents gave their teenage children strict instructions about what to do if they were pulled over. At the courthouse, a respected judge with over 2 decades of experience began noticing something unusual in the cases coming before him. The traffic violations and minor offenses from Officer Reynolds' arrests showed a troubling trend. The judge, known for his careful attention to detail, started keeping notes. The numbers didn't lie. Nearly 80% of Reynolds' stops involved minority residents, even though they made up less than 30% of the town's population. Behind the scenes, some of Reynolds' fellow officers felt uneasy. Officer Chen, a rookie on the force, witnessed Reynolds making inappropriate comments during briefings. Officer Rodriguez overheard him using subtle racial slurs when no supervisors were around. But in a department where loyalty was valued above all else, speaking up felt risky. The local newspaper's young reporter started digging into public records. She found that complaints against Reynolds had tripled in the past year, but none had led to any disciplinary action. When she tried to interview community members, many were too scared to go on record. "I have to live here," one person told her. "I can't afford to make enemies." The judge continued gathering evidence, carefully documenting each case that came across his bench. He noticed how Reynolds' reports often contained similar language, as if copied and pasted, with crucial details missing or contradicting witness statements. Body camera footage would mysteriously be corrupted or unavailable in cases where complaints were filed. In the town's coffee shops and diners, conversations would drop to whispers whenever police officers walked in. The sense of community that once made Pine Valley special was starting to crack. But change was coming, though no one knew it yet. The truth had a way of surfacing, like water finding its path through rock. As autumn turned to winter, tensions continued to build. The judge kept working late into the night, reviewing case after case, knowing that something would have to give. He understood the weight of what he was uncovering. This wasn't just about one officer or even one department. It was about the very essence of justice and what it meant to serve and protect all members of a community. Little did anyone know that a single traffic stop in the coming weeks would break this dam of silence, setting in motion events that would transform not just Pine Valley, but serve as an example for communities across the country. The truth was about to come to light, and nothing would ever be the same. The evening that changed everything started like any other in Pine Valley. The streets were quiet, with just a few cars heading home from late shifts. At the hospital, a highly respected surgeon was finishing up her paperwork when her phone buzzed urgently. A young patient needed emergency surgery. Every minute counted. She grabbed her keys and rushed to her car. The surgeon had made this drive countless times during her 15 years at Pine Valley General. She knew every turn, every traffic light, and exactly how long it would take to reach the hospital. Her mind was already running through the surgical procedures she'd need to perform. The flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror came as a surprise. She checked her speed. She wasn't speeding. Her heart sank when she recognized Officer Reynolds' patrol car. The surgeon had heard the whispers, the stories shared in hospital break rooms about his behavior, but she'd never encountered him personally. She pulled over, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel just as her father had taught her years ago. Through her mirror, she could see Reynolds taking his time, walking slowly to her car. Her phone buzzed again. The hospital. Time was slipping away. License and registration, Reynolds demanded, his flashlight beam unnecessarily bright in her eyes. She explained about the emergency surgery, showing her hospital ID and medical credentials along with her license. A surgeon? His tone dripped with disbelief. In this car. What happened next was captured perfectly by Reynolds' body camera, the very technology meant to protect both officers and civilians. His questioning grew increasingly aggressive. When she mentioned the waiting patient, he made her step out of the car. The night air was cold against her face as she stood there, still wearing her hospital scrubs under her coat. These could be fake, he said, examining her hospital ID. We've had a lot of people trying to impersonate medical staff lately. It wasn't true. No such cases had been reported in Pine Valley. The surgeon kept her voice steady, though inside she was thinking of her patient, knowing that every minute of delay could have serious consequences. A second patrol car pulled up. The arriving officer recognized the surgeon immediately. She had operated on his mother last year. His presence changed the dynamic, but Reynolds was too far down his chosen path. He had already called in to run a full check on her license, registration, and medical credentials. By the time Reynolds finally let her go, precious minutes had ticked away. The surgeon arrived at the hospital, shaken but focused. The emergency surgery was successful, but it had been a close call, too close. The next day, she did something she'd never done before. She filed a formal complaint. The surgeon's complaint was different from previous ones. She was well known and respected in the community. Her detailed account, backed by body camera footage, medical records proving her emergency call, and witness testimony from the second officer, couldn't be easily dismissed. When the case landed in court, it caught the judge's full attention. Here was the catalyst he'd been waiting for. A clear, well-documented incident that showcased the pattern he'd been tracking. The surgeon's professional standing, combined with the irrefutable timeline of events, made her case impossible to ignore. The body camera footage was particularly damning. While Reynolds' written report claimed the surgeon had been uncooperative and evasive, the video showed a calm medical professional trying to explain an emergency situation while being subjected to increasingly hostile questioning. Word of the incident spread through Pine Valley like wildfire. Hospital staff shared their own stories. Other professionals came forward with similar experiences. The local coffee shops buzzed with conversations about that night, about the surgeon who finally stood up, about the patient whose life hung in the balance because of one officer's prejudices. The wall of silence was starting to crumble. What happened that night would become more than just another complaint filed away and forgotten. It would become the turning point that Pine Valley needed, the moment when one person's courage would inspire others to speak up, setting in motion changes that would reshape their community. The truth was finally coming to light, but this was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, as those who'd witnessed injustice found their voices, and those in power would be forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own system. The courthouse lights burned late into the night. The judge sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of case files, his coffee long cold. The surgeon's case had opened a door, and now he couldn't stop looking through it. Each file told a story, and together they painted a picture that kept him awake at night. His clerk had noticed his changed routine. "You've been here until midnight every day this week," she said, concerned. But the judge knew this was too important to rush. He'd been on the bench for 20 years, and he'd never seen anything quite like this. He started with the past year's traffic stops. The numbers jumped out immediately. Officer Reynolds had pulled over minority drivers at 4 times the rate of other officers. But it wasn't just the numbers. It was the stories hidden in the paperwork, the little details that didn't add up. In one case, a shop owner had been stopped for a broken taillight. The photos from the scene showed all lights working perfectly. Another file showed a teacher detained for suspicious behavior, while grading papers in his parked car outside the school. The teacher had been doing this for 10 years without incident until Reynolds started patrolling that beat. The judge created a timeline on his office wall, using sticky notes and string like a detective in a TV show. Yellow notes for traffic stops, blue for complaints, red for incidents where body camera footage was mysteriously missing. The pattern was impossible to ignore. He found something else troubling: the language in Reynolds' reports. Certain phrases kept appearing. Appeared nervous, refused to make eye contact, made suspicious movements. These same words, used over and over, trying to justify stops that had no real cause. The judge's investigation didn't go unnoticed. One evening, an older officer knocked on his chamber door. "I've been on the force for 30 years, the officer said, his voice quiet. "What's happening isn't right. But people are scared to speak up." He shared stories of younger officers being pressured to stay quiet, of complaints being buried, of a system that protected its own at the expense of justice. Community members started finding their way to the courthouse too. A grandmother brought in a shoebox full of receipts. She'd been documenting every interaction her family had with Reynolds for the past year. A high school student shared cell phone videos his friends had taken. A business owner provided security camera footage showing Reynolds' behavior during routine checks. The judge treated each piece of evidence with care. He knew that people were risking a lot by coming forward. Each story added another thread to the tapestry he was weaving, another proof that this wasn't just a few isolated incidents. Late one night, reviewing body camera footage, he found something crucial. In the background of one video, Reynolds could be heard bragging to another officer about how he kept certain people in line. The other officer looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. It was the kind of casual conversation that revealed the true culture of the department. The evidence was mounting, but the judge knew that building a case like this was like walking through a minefield. One wrong step, one piece of mishandled evidence, and the whole thing could fall apart. He'd seen too many attempts at police reform fail because the case wasn't strong enough. He worked methodically, cross-referencing every statement, verifying every piece of evidence. His wife worried about him, saying he looked tired at dinner. But she understood. Sometimes, she told him, doing the right thing means losing sleep. The surgeon's case had been the catalyst, but what the judge was uncovering went far deeper. This wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about a system that had allowed bias and discrimination to flourish unchecked. It was about the trust between law enforcement and the community they were supposed to serve. As he organized the final pieces of evidence, the judge knew the hardest part was still to come. Building the case was one thing. Presenting it in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed was another. But he was ready. The truth had to come out, no matter how uncomfortable it might make people feel. The morning of the hearing arrived with an unusual buzz in the courthouse. The case seemed routine on paper. A young college student charged with resisting arrest. But something felt different. The regular courthouse staff noticed the judge had arrived earlier than usual, carrying a thick folder under his arm. The student was a bright kid, Dean's List at the local university, working 2 jobs to pay for his education. His crime had been questioning why Officer Reynolds had stopped him while he was walking to his night shift at the library. The official report claimed he had been wandering suspiciously in a college neighborhood, the same neighborhood where he'd lived for the past 3 years. The courtroom filled up quietly. Regular morning cases were moved to other courts. Word had gotten around that something important was about to happen. The student's family sat in the front row, worried but hopeful. Behind them, Faces both familiar and new filled the benches. The surgeon from the hospital incident, small business owners, teachers, and other community members who had their own stories to tell. Officer Reynolds strutted in, confident as always. He'd done this hundreds of times. Present his report, give his testimony, watch another case go his way. He barely glanced at the student or his family as he took his place at the witness stand. The questioning started normally enough. The judge's voice was calm, measured, as he asked Reynolds to describe the incident. The officer repeated his usual story, using those same familiar phrases: suspicious behavior, refused to comply, aggressive stance. Then something changed. The judge pulled out a document. "Officer Reynolds, could you explain why your body camera was turned off during this incident?" Reynolds shifted in his seat, giving his standard response about technical difficulties. But the judge wasn't finished. "I have here," the judge continued, "footage from the library's security camera covering the exact time and location of this incident." The courtroom grew so quiet you could hear the old ceiling fans creaking. "Would you like to watch it with us?" The footage played on the courtroom screen. It showed a very different story than the one in Reynolds' report. The student was clearly walking to work, wearing his library staff badge. Reynolds' aggressive approach, the unnecessary escalation, it was all there in black and white. But the judge wasn't done. He began connecting the dots, methodically presenting evidence from other cases. Security camera footage that contradicted police reports. Statistics showing the pattern of discriminatory stops. Testimony from other officers about Reynolds' comments and behavior. Reynolds' confidence began to crack. His answers became defensive, then contradictory. When confronted with his own words from previous cases, he struggled to explain the inconsistencies. The familiar phrases in his reports now seemed hollow, rehearsed. The turning point came when the judge presented the body camera footage from the surgeon's incident. "Officer Reynolds, you wrote in your report that the surgeon was uncooperative and aggressive. Yet this footage shows a medical professional calmly explaining an emergency situation. Could you explain this discrepancy?" Reynolds' face reddened. His answers became shorter, his tone sharper. The carefully constructed facade was crumbling in front of everyone. Some of his fellow officers, sitting in the back of the courtroom, began to look uncomfortable, averting their eyes. The judge's questioning was relentless but fair, each question backed by concrete evidence. He wasn't just challenging one incident. He was exposing a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. The student's case had become something much bigger. As the hearing progressed, you could feel the shift in the courtroom. People who had been afraid to speak up for years were witnessing something they never thought they'd see: someone in power being held accountable. The hearing concluded with the judge dismissing all charges against the student. But everyone knew this was just the beginning. The judge announced he would be forwarding all evidence to the Internal Affairs Department and the District Attorney's Office for further investigation. As people filed out of the courtroom that day, there was a sense that they had witnessed something historic. The wall of silence had finally been broken, and the truth had come out in the one place where it mattered most, a court of law, where justice was supposed to be blind to everything except the facts. News of the courtroom revelation spread through Pine Valley like wildfire. The local newspaper ran the story on its front page. People who had never spoken up before suddenly found their courage. The small trickle of evidence the judge had discovered turned into a flood. The Internal Affairs Department, which had been quiet for so long, sprang into action. They couldn't ignore this anymore. Not with the evidence laid out so clearly in court, not with the media attention, not with the community finally finding its voice. A young officer who'd been on the force for just 2 years was the first to step forward. "I saw things during my training that didn't feel right," she told the investigators. She described how Reynolds had taught rookie officers to profile certain drivers, making up reasons for stops if they had to. Her hands shook as she gave her statement, but her voice remained steady. The owner of a local diner became an unexpected hub for people sharing their stories. His restaurant had always been a meeting place for both police officers and community members. Now, people would come in, order a cup of coffee, and start talking. He kept a notebook under the counter, jotting down dates and details as people shared their experiences. I saw him do it plenty of times, a retired officer admitted over breakfast one morning. But back then, we were told to mind our own business. Keep our heads down. The retired officer had carried that guilt for years. Now, finally, he could unburden himself. The investigation uncovered more than just Reynolds' actions. It revealed a department culture that had allowed bias to flourish. Some officers had tried to report problems before but were told to stay in their lane. Others had witnessed inappropriate behavior but feared retaliation if they spoke up. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, now overflowed with people wanting to be heard. The high school gymnasium had to be used to accommodate the crowds. People lined up at the microphone, sharing stories that went back years. Some broke down in tears, finally able to speak about experiences they'd kept hidden. A group of local college students created a website where people could safely share their experiences. The stories poured in, hundreds of them. Each one was carefully documented, creating a timeline that showed just how long these problems had existed. The police chief, who had initially defended his department, couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. Body camera footage that had been lost mysteriously reappeared. Internal emails showed complaints being buried or dismissed without investigation. The problem went deeper than anyone had imagined. Local business owners started speaking up about the protection fees they'd been pressured to pay. A car repair shop owner revealed how Reynolds would send cars to specific shops for repairs after accidents, getting kickbacks in return. The corruption wasn't just about bias. It was about power and money too. The district attorney's office assigned a special team to review every case Reynolds had been involved in over the past 5 years. They found dozens of cases that needed to be reopened, convictions that needed to be questioned. Each file represented someone whose life had been affected by one officer's actions. The investigation spread to other officers who had worked closely with Reynolds. Some had been actively involved in his schemes, while others had simply looked the other way. The blue wall of silence was crumbling, brick by brick. One afternoon, a small group of officers came to the judge's chambers. They weren't there to defend Reynolds or make excuses. They wanted to talk about making real changes in the department. "We got into this job to help people," one said. "We need to get back to that." As the investigation continued, Pine Valley began to feel different. People who had avoided eye contact with police officers started engaging in conversations. Officers who had felt trapped in a corrupt system began to see a way forward. The truth was painful, but it was also cleansing. The investigation wasn't just about punishing one officer anymore. It had become about healing a community, about rebuilding trust that had been broken for far too long. Each new revelation, though difficult to hear, brought them one step closer to the change they needed. The day of the disciplinary hearing dawned clear and cold. The county administration building, usually quiet, was surrounded by news vans and community members. Inside, the hearing room was packed. People who couldn't fit inside gathered in the hallway, listening through open doors. Officer Reynolds sat at a table, looking smaller somehow without his uniform. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a tightness around his eyes. His union lawyer shuffled papers beside him, but they both knew what was coming. The evidence was too strong, the stories too numerous, the proof too clear. The hearing board consisted of 5 people, 2 senior officers from neighboring counties, 2 civilian oversight members, and a retired judge. They'd spent weeks reviewing the evidence. Hundreds of traffic stops, dozens of complaints, hours of body camera footage, and testimonies from both officers and community members. The surgeon testified first, her voice steady as she described that night when minutes could have meant life or death for her patient. Then came the college student, explaining how a simple walk to work turned into a nightmare. One by one, people stepped forward to share their experiences. But it wasn't just civilians testifying. Officers, both current and retired, spoke about what they'd witnessed. The young officer who'd been in training described how Reynolds had taught officers to target certain neighborhoods. A senior officer admitted to staying silent when he should have spoken up. The evidence was presented methodically. Statistics showed the stark pattern of discriminatory stops. Body camera footage revealed the difference between what was reported and what actually happened. Internal Affairs investigators outlined their findings about the kickback scheme with local repair shops. During a break, the diner owner, who'd collected so many stories, handed out coffee to people waiting in the hallway. "Never thought I'd see this day," he said, shaking his head. "All these years, people were afraid to speak up. Now look at this crowd." The judge who had started it all sat quietly in the back of the room. He wasn't there to testify. His courtroom revelations had set everything in motion. He watched as the truth he uncovered was finally laid bare for everyone to see. Reynolds' defense crumbled under the weight of evidence. His lawyer tried to paint it as a few isolated incidents, but the pattern was undeniable. When Reynolds finally spoke, his excuses sounded hollow. He talked about stress, about the dangers of the job, about split-second decisions. But he couldn't explain away years of documented bias and abuse of power. The hearing board's decision was unanimous. Reynolds was stripped of his badge. His pension was revoked. Criminal charges would follow. But the board went further. They recommended a complete overhaul of department policies, mandatory bias training, and the creation of a permanent civilian oversight committee. Outside the building, a small celebration broke out. People hugged and cried. The college student's mother thanked the surgeon who had started it all. The young officer who testified found herself surrounded by community members offering support. But not everyone was celebrating. Some officers worried about what these changes would mean for them. Others felt angry about a fellow officer being thrown under the bus. Change never comes easily, especially to institutions set in their ways. The local newspaper's headline the next day read, "Justice served. Officer fired. Department reforms coming." Below the headline was a photo of community members and honest police officers standing together on the building steps, showing a united front for change. That evening, at his usual dinner spot, the judge overheard conversations about the hearing. People weren't just talking about Reynolds anymore. They were discussing how to make sure nothing like this happened again. They were talking about building bridges, about working together, about making their community better. The reckoning hadn't been easy. It had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about their community. But as the sun set on that historic day, there was a sense that Pine Valley was finally heading in the right direction. The path forward wouldn't be smooth, but at least now they were walking it together. 5 years after the historic hearing, Pine Valley had become a different place. The changes weren't just on paper. You could feel them in the air, see them in the small daily interactions between police officers and community members. At the newly renovated police station, a wall displayed photos of community events. Officers playing basketball with local kids, police community picnics, graduation ceremonies from joint training programs. But the real changes went much deeper than pictures on a wall. Every new officer now went through extensive bias training, led by community members themselves. The retired judge who had started it all was a regular speaker, sharing the story of how one person's courage to speak up had transformed an entire community. The surgeon who had first challenged Officer Reynolds now sat on the Civilian Oversight Board. "I never planned to be an activist," she told a group of new recruits. "I was just trying to save my patient that night. But sometimes standing up for what's right takes you down unexpected paths." Body cameras had become more than just equipment. They were a symbol of transparency. Officers welcomed them, knowing they protected both the police and the public. The footage was regularly reviewed, not just for problems, but to highlight examples of good policing and positive community interactions. The diner that had once been a place where people whispered their stories had transformed too. Now it was where officers and community members met regularly for coffee with cop sessions. Real conversations happened over cups of coffee and plates of pancakes. The owner had finally retired his notebook of complaints. He didn't need it anymore. The college student whose case had led to the courtroom showdown had graduated and become a lawyer. He worked with the police department on community outreach programs, turning his own experience into something positive. What happened to me was wrong, he told students at the local high school, but look at what we built from it. The young officer who had first spoken up about Reynolds' training methods was now a sergeant, helping to shape the department's new culture. She made sure every rookie understood that their job wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about serving and protecting everyone in the community, regardless of who they were. Even the physical landscape of Pine Valley had changed. The old high-crime areas that Reynolds had targeted were now thriving neighborhoods. Community policing programs had replaced aggressive patrols. Officers knew the residents by name, attended neighborhood meetings, and helped organize local events. The police chief's office had a new policy. Every complaint was investigated, no matter how small. The blue wall of silence had been replaced by a culture of accountability. Officers who saw problems were encouraged to speak up, knowing they would be protected, not punished. One sunny afternoon, a minor traffic accident brought together two worlds that had once been divided. The responding officer handled everything with such professionalism and respect that the older resident involved in the accident began to cry. "I've lived here 40 years, she told the officer, "and I never thought I'd see the day when I wouldn't be afraid during a traffic stop." The local newspaper ran a series called 5 Years Later, documenting the changes. They interviewed dozens of people: officers, business owners, teachers, students. The stories were different, but the message was the same. Pine Valley had become a model for other communities struggling with similar issues. Other police departments started sending officers to learn from Pine Valley's example. They wanted to know how a department had managed to rebuild trust, reform its practices, and strengthen its community ties. The answer was always the same. It started with one person willing to stand up for what was right. The judge, now retired, often walked through town, seeing the fruits of what he had started. Sometimes he stopped at the diner for coffee, listening to the easy conversation between officers and residents. The fear and tension that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by something that felt a lot like hope. Pine Valley's transformation hadn't been easy. Change never is. But they had proven that when people come together, when they're willing to face hard truths and do the work to make things better, real change is possible. Their story became a beacon of hope for other communities, showing that justice, when pursued with courage and determination, could truly transform a town.